In the sun-drenched suburbs of North Texas, where the grass is perfectly manicured and the dream of a forever home is a cultural staple, a new kind of predator emerged in 2020. They didn't look like criminals. They looked like the neighbors you'd invite to a backyard barbecue. Christopher and Raquel Judge, the faces behind Judge DFW LLC, didn't just sell construction. They sold a lifestyle, a feeling of safety, and a vision of architectural perfection. But as 40 families would eventually learn, the only thing the Judges were truly building was a $5 million lie. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The scheme began not on a construction site, but on a smartphone screen. Raquel Judge was the architect of the brand's image. She understood that in affluent areas like South Lake and the Alliance Corridor, trust is the most valuable currency. She embedded herself into the digital heart of these communities, joining Moms of South Lake and Alliance Working Moms Facebook groups. Her posts weren't aggressive sales pitches. They were curated windows into a life of high-end design and family values. She presented herself as a busy, professional mother who understood the needs of other families. This wasn't just marketing, it was psychological grooming. By the time a homeowner reached out to Judge DFW, the barrier of skepticism had already been lowered because Raquel is one of us. When the phone calls turned into in-person meetings, Christopher Judge stepped into the light. He wasn't just a general contractor. He was introduced as the architect and builder. This specific title, architect, is the cornerstone of the entire federal case. In the state of Texas, architect is a protected title governed by the Texas Board of Architectural Examiners, TBAE. To use it, you must have the education, the years of internship, and the state-issued license. Christopher had none of these. However, by claiming the title, he convinced victims that he possessed a level of structural and aesthetic expertise that justified his one-stop-shop business model. He promised that because he was the architect, the designer, and the builder, there would be no middleman, no miscommunication, and, crucially, no unnecessary costs. To close the deals, the Judges used a below-market bid strategy. In a post-pandemic world where lumber prices were skyrocketing and contractors were booked out for years, the Judges offered the impossible: high-end custom homes and massive renovations with a 4 to 6 month completion guarantee, all at a price that undercut the competition. For families like Kristen Newman's, the offer was irresistible. Newman, who had just finished paying off her law school loans, saw an opportunity to finally build her dream home. She wasn't looking for a bargain. She was looking for the professional excellence the Judges projected on TikTok and Instagram. The initial contracts were professional, often requiring a $10,000 commitment fee or design deposit. Raquel would manage these transactions, sending over the paperwork via email and ensuring the wires were sent to their Chase business account. The first day on a job site was often a masterclass in theater. Victims described crews arriving in force, stripping houses down to the studs in a single day. It was a blitz of activity designed to convince the homeowner that their money was being put to immediate use. But as the studs stood bare and the weeks turned into months, that initial burst of energy would prove to be the last time many victims saw any meaningful progress. The Judges were leveraging the home renovation boom of 2020 to 2023. They knew that once a home was stripped to its bones, the homeowner was essentially a hostage. You couldn't just fire them and hire someone else. The one-stop shop meant the Judges held the plans, the permits or lack thereof, and the money. When homeowners began to ask why the framing was sitting exposed to the Texas rain, or why the custom windows they had paid for hadn't arrived, Christopher's tone would shift. The charming Chip Gaines persona disappeared, replaced by a man who was always in a meeting, dealing with a supplier issue, or, most dangerously, demanding one more draw to keep the project alive. By late 2021, the cracks weren't just in the business model. They were in the foundations of the homes themselves. The Judges were juggling at least 24 different projects across 6 counties, including Tarrant, Denton, and Parker. Each new deposit was a lifeline, not for the project it was intended for, but to keep the Judges' personal lives afloat and to keep the most vocal, angry victims from calling the police. They were running a construction Ponzi scheme where the returns weren't dividends, but the mere appearance of a roof or a pile of lumber on a driveway. As the families began to compare notes in secret Facebook groups, they realized that the luxury work Christopher was overseeing wasn't just slow, it was physically failing. One victim, an ex-police officer named Lane Simmons, decided to climb into his own crawl space with a flashlight. What he saw there would prove that the judges weren't just stealing money. They were building death traps. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The second phase of the Judge DFW investigation moved from the digital world of social media into the physical wreckage of North Texas homes. Lane Simmons, who had served as a police officer for 13 years, knew how to spot a lie, but even he was blindsided by the judges' Chip and Joanna vibe. He and his wife, Kaylee, had hired the couple to remodel their Euless family home. They paid nearly $200,000, expecting a total transformation. Instead, they were left with a house that was a literal code violation nightmare. Within weeks of the completion of certain sections, tiles began to crack, floors began to warp, but the most terrifying discovery was the staircase. In any two-story home, the staircase is a massive structural element. In the Simmons home, an independent inspector discovered that the entire staircase was structurally unsound. It wasn't anchored to the frame of the house according to any known building code. Instead, it was found to be held up by a single piece of scrap board tucked inside the drywall, a propped-up disaster waiting to collapse. The inspector told Lane it was the worst job I've probably ever seen. This was the recurring theme across the judge's projects. The work wasn't just poor, it was fundamentally unsafe. The architect lie was the catalyst for this danger. Because Christopher claimed to be a licensed architect, many homeowners skipped the step of hiring a third-party structural engineer or architect to verify the plans. They trusted that Christopher was the expert. However, the Texas Board of Architectural Examiners, TBAE, had already flagged him. In May 2022, the state issued a formal warning to Christopher Judge and Judge DFW LLC. They were informed that they were in direct violation of the Texas Administrative Code. Neither Christopher nor the entity was registered to practice architecture in Texas. This warning should have been the end of the business. Legally, they were ordered to stop using the term architecture and to stop portraying Christopher as an architect. But the judges did the opposite. They intensified their marketing, explicitly telling new victims in emails and text messages that they were a one-stop shop for architecture, construction, and interior design. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a willful, criminal defiance of state law. They knew the architect title was the only way to justify the massive draws they were requesting. As the structural issues mounted, so did the financial pressure. Kristen Newman's experience mirrored the Simmons. She had paid for windows and doors that never arrived. When she tracked down the suppliers, she found out the judges had never even placed the orders, despite taking the draws specifically for those materials. When she confronted Christopher and asked for her money back, specifically the money for work that hadn't been started, his response was a chilling admission of the scheme's collapse. "I don't have it anymore." The $5 million wasn't disappearing into high lumber costs or supply chain issues. It was being diverted into a complex web of accounts. The federal indictment would later show that the judges were commingling funds. They would take a check from a family in Decatur and immediately use it to pay off a civil settlement from a family in Fort Worth. This is the definition of a Ponzi scheme, using new capital to pay off old liabilities, with no actual value being created in between. Subcontractors were also victims in this phase. The judges would hire crews to do the demolition phase to keep the homeowners happy, but then they would fail to pay those crews. This led to mechanics' liens being placed on the victims' homes. Not only had the homeowners paid the judges for the work, but now they were legally responsible for paying the subcontractors a second time, or risk losing their homes to the state. The emotional toll during this period was devastating. Victims reported living in half houses with their children, surrounded by exposed wiring, mold from unsealed roofs, and sinking floors. One family, the Congletons, was forced to live in an RV for 18 months because their home was stripped to the studs and abandoned. Jeremy Congleton ended up having to file for bankruptcy and finish the construction himself. The dream had become a permanent financial and emotional scar. As the pile of civil lawsuits grew, the judges realized that a simple breach of contract lawsuit wouldn't stop them. They continued to live in luxury, even as their victims lived in RVs. But they made one fatal mistake. They didn't realize that a specialized detective in Euless had stopped looking at their business disputes and started looking at their bank statements. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The transition from a civil dispute to a federal criminal case happened when the paper trail was finally unmasked, detailing the specific evidence gathered by the Euless Police Department, the FBI, and the U.S. Secret Service. This was no longer about bad construction. It was about the $865,000 the judges spent on themselves while their clients' houses crumbled. When Detective Brian Brennan of the Euless Police Department began looking into the judges, he realized the scope was too large for a local municipality. He brought in the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division and the Secret Service Task Force. Together, they subpoenaed the records for the Judge DFW LLC business accounts at Chase Bank. What they found was a ledger of greed that spanned from October 2020 to January 2023. The indictment provided a line-by-line breakdown of the personal spending. The judges didn't just take a small draw for living expenses. They treated the victims' home deposits like a winning lottery ticket. They spent approximately $285,000 on payroll payments to themselves. This was money that families like the Newmans believed was going toward roofing and plumbing. Instead, it was being used to fund the judge's personal lifestyle. The most shocking details in the federal complaint involved how the judges chose to spend the stolen $4.8 million. They spent $82,000 on Amazon.com purchases. They spent $10,000 at Walmart. They even used the money to pay $27,000 toward their own personal mortgage, ensuring their own roof was secure while their clients' roofs were leaking. But the detail that sparked the most outrage among the 40 victims was the $10,000 spent on plastic surgery. While a mother in North Texas was wondering if she could afford to fix her sinking kitchen floor, Raquel and Christopher Judge were using that mother's money to pay for cosmetic enhancements. The financial records also proved the wire fraud component of the case, because the judges instructed victims to send money via wire transfers or checks that were deposited into interstate banking systems. The crime fell under federal jurisdiction. Each wire transfer was a separate act in the conspiracy. The FBI tracked more than 40 victims across 6 counties, noting that the judges had perfected a draw schedule that maximized the amount of money they could extract before the homeowner realized something was wrong. Raquel Judge's involvement was proven to be far from passive. The indictment detailed how she was the closer. She set up the meetings, she managed the design and build contracts, and she was the primary contact for the $10,000 initial deposits. She used social media not just for ads, but to vet potential victims, looking for people in high-income neighborhoods who were likely to have the liquidity to pay for custom homes. She also managed the excuse phase, sending emails and texts to stall victims, assuring them that materials were on backorder, when, in reality, the money had already been spent at a plastic surgeon's office. The judges also used the stolen funds to defend their original thefts. They spent approximately $70,000 on civil legal fees. When a victim would sue them in civil court, the judges would use the money they stole from another victim to pay their defense attorneys. This created a legal shield that allowed them to stay in business for years, even as a mountain of lawsuits piled up behind them. The scale of the Ponzi aspect was massive. The indictment states that they defrauded over 40 victims on at least 24 different construction projects. One couple in Decatur paid a staggering $364,000. Another couple made 12 separate payments, only to realize that almost none of it had reached the subcontractors. The judges weren't just robbing Peter to pay Paul. They were robbing Peter, Paul, and 40 other people to pay for their own Amazon hauls and surgeries. The investigation also highlighted the architect fraud once again. The FBI found that Christopher Judge had used his fake credentials to sign off on documents that required a licensed professional seal. By doing this, he wasn't just lying. He was creating a paper trail of fraudulent professional services that put every building he touched at risk of being condemned. With the bank records in hand and the TBAE warning as proof of intent, the federal government moved in. But the judges had one more card to play. As the indictments were unsealed, they realized that the federal government doesn't just want the money back, they want time. Christopher and Raquel had to decide. Would they go to trial and risk 20 years? Or would they take a plea deal that would force them to admit the truth to every family they had destroyed? For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The final phase of the Judge DFW case took place in the Northern District of Texas Federal Court. In late 2025 and early 2026, the dream builders of North Texas finally traded their custom homes for federal prison cells. Both Christopher and Raquel Judge entered guilty pleas to 1 count each of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. In the federal system, a conspiracy charge is often used when 2 or more people work together to commit a crime, and it carries the same weight as the crime itself. Christopher Judge, as the lead in the physical construction and the one who falsely claimed to be an architect, faced a significantly higher maximum sentence, 20 years in federal prison. Raquel, who managed the social media and administrative side, faced a maximum of 5 years. The sentencing was handled through a C-plea agreement. This is a specific legal tool where the prosecution and defense agree on a sentencing range that they believe is fair, which the judge must then bless. For Christopher, the agreed-upon sentence was not to exceed 78 months, 6.5 years. To the victims, this seemed like a light sentence for a $5 million theft that ruined 40 lives. However, the federal points system provides a mathematical explanation for this number. Under the federal sentencing guidelines, wire fraud starts at a base offense level of 7. Then, points are added based on the amount of loss. Since the loss was approximately $4.8 million, 18 points were added. More points were added because there were more than 10 victims, adding 2 points, and because Christopher used sophisticated means, the fake architecture firm. However, by pleading guilty, Christopher received a 3-point reduction for acceptance of responsibility. When these points are plotted on a grid against his criminal history, the result is the 63 to 78-month range. The restitution order was the most painful part of the final hearing. The judge ordered the judges to pay back the full $4,775,322.25 to the victims. But as criminal defense attorney Randy Zeeland noted, an order of restitution is often just a piece of paper. Since Christopher was represented by a government-appointed lawyer, it was clear that the $5 million was gone. The $82,000 spent on Amazon, the $10,000 on plastic surgery, and the $285,000 in personal payroll could not be unspent. For the victims, the aftermath is a lifetime of financial recovery. Kristen Newman, who spent an additional $200,000 just to make her home livable after paying the judges $200,000, eventually had to sell the property and move back in with her parents. She described the experience not as a bad business deal, but as a series of calculated choices by the judges to steal and lie. Lane Simmons is still spending tens of thousands to fix the unsafe staircase and the sinking floors. The legacy of the Judge DFW case has changed how North Texas law enforcement handles construction complaints. It proved that when a contractor takes a draw for materials and spends it on a luxury lifestyle instead, it is not a civil matter, it is a criminal theft. The Euless Police Department and the FBI sent a clear message. The social media mirage will not protect you from the federal government. As of early 2026, Raquel Judge's sentencing is set for April 14th, and Christopher's is set for May 12th, both before U.S. District Judge Terry R. Means. They will likely be required to serve at least 85% of their time, as the federal system does not have parole in the traditional state sense. For the 40 families who were left in the cold, the prison sentences offer some closure, but no financial relief. The case stands as a warning to every homeowner. Before you hire a Chip and Joanna Gaines type, you must verify their credentials. You must check the TBAE database for architectural licenses. You must verify with subcontractors that they are being paid. And most importantly, you must remember that a professional-looking Instagram feed can be the most dangerous tool in a con artist's kit. The judges built their house of cards on the trust of their community, and in the end, that community was left to clear the rubble. And as always, you've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every story is told with facts, clarity, and respect for the people affected. If you want to see more fact-based true crime stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, remember, the truth is never buried.